I think this is probably Rachel Reeves who sent us a question, cloaking her own identity.
Much of this is done on the prognostications of the OBR,
Yes.
which is an organisation that is so consistently wrong in its predictions that half of me wonders if they did it with like that octopus that can predict football matches, like we might get better results.
The Treasury is the puncturer of illusions and the dissolver of dreams.
Boris Johnson for Archbishop.
Precisely.
What changes do you think could be made to it to make it more effective, or perhaps changes to the fundamental structure of the Treasury and the amount of power that it has?
I think... Hello and welcome to Quite Right. I'm Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator.
And I'm Madeline Grant, assistant editor and parliamentary sketch writer of The Spectator.
This week on Quite Right Questions and Answers, we'll be exploring the role of the Treasury, who should lead the BBC, and Mar-a-Lago face. Is this American syndrome spreading to it?
Our first question comes from Anon. Is the Treasury fit for purpose?
I think this is probably Rachel Reeves who sent us a question, cloaking her own identity. And again, I suppose it provokes the initial question, what is the purpose of the Treasury? So if the purpose of the Treasury is to meet all ideas from other government departments and to suck its teeth and say, nah, in as persistent a way as possible, then it does its job brilliantly. What the Treasury does in government is to act as the perpetual skeptic. It is the enemy of innovation. It is also the banisher of waste, but it is not the powerhouse for growth that I imagine this government had hoped that it might be. And it hasn't been throughout its history. There have been various different efforts by prime ministers to consider whether or not there should be an alternative department for growth. Obviously, most notoriously when Harold Wilson asked George Brown to set up the Department of Economic Affairs, and there have been, efforts, John Major trying to make Michael Heseltine sort of counterweight to it when he was at the industry department. But they all fail because the Treasury has the capacity to say no, and the Chancellor has the capacity to kibosh or stymie almost any other department. Now, for a particular type of Conservative, there is a merit in that the Treasury is the puncturer of illusions and the dissolver of dreams. And so if you are a cold, hard, not quite Scrooge-like, but certainly pessimistic hoarder of the taxpayers' cash, then the Treasury is for you.
Well, there's even a kind of term for it, a sort of cognitive defect known as Treasury brain, which I find interesting. There's that it's the only department that really gets blamed in that way. And I do take all your points about, there is this perhaps a economic short-termism in the Treasury when they are very good at penny pinching, less good at factoring in longer term benefits. They're often criticized for not putting more money into infrastructure, for example. And they kind of genuinely, they can't really see the value in doing many things at all. And therefore they become focused entirely on the business of short-term revenue raising, cash flow, debt management, etc. I also do wonder, though, if there is a case where the Treasury is often scapegoated for ministerial failings, and sometimes left-wing MPs will often also talk about Treasury brain because they'll say it's not giving us enough money for X, Y, or Z project. Some of these projects that they cite probably do have a very low return on investment. And so maybe the Treasury has a point in circumstances.
Oh, sure.
But definitely with the ministerial issues, I think we're seeing more input from the Treasury at present because Rachel Reeves is a chancellor who lacks vision and that didn't come in with a particularly strong idea of what she wanted to do. And I think good evidence of this is that there are quite a few policies that, if I understood correctly, the Treasury basically proposed to everyone who's in government, and they're usually rebuffed. The family farms tax being a good example of this. But Rachel's team were only too happy to kind of accede to their suggestions. So perhaps you're more likely to see Treasury brain when there is like an absence of strong direction coming from the centre, perhaps.
I think it's completely correct. I think that as well as Treasury brain, there was a phenomenon that I noted when I was in government, which is that some civil servants who hadn't spent most of their career in the Treasury would refer to Treasury boys. And the Treasury boys are a particular type of male civil servant, normally called something like Dan or Max or Will. Almost all, but not all, Oxbridge or LSE, all of them with firsts, and all of them with a certainty born of sharp intelligence and not contempt, but a certain pity for ministers on the basis that they're here today, gone tomorrow figures who have to worry about pesky things like voters' attitudes and public sentiment. And they're possessed, they believe, and in many cases actually are possessed, of a sort of rational insight into economic theory, which means that whenever new ministers arrive, whether that's Rachel Reeves or others, are anxious to house train them, to ensure that they can see the benefits of the Treasury boys' world view. And they have, exactly as you say, a pre-prepared set of policies like changing inheritance tax to hit farmers, or like equalizing VAT on hot and cold food, otherwise known as pasties. It is the job to exercise a degree of robustness, but not everyone is intellectually confident enough to do that. Famously, Nigel Lawson was. He enjoyed taking on the Treasury boys in argument and beating them. Gordon Brown, similarly, had his own sort of version of the Treasury boy, in that Ed Balls, had he not been Gordon Brown's special advisor, would have fitted very neatly into Treasury civil service life, but he was a poacher turned gamekeeper, as it were. And George Osborne, similarly, had in Rupert Harrison and Matt Hancock his own versions of the Treasury boys. That doesn't mean that in order to master the Treasury, that you need to have recruited or suborned people from its ranks, but it does mean that you need to be aware of their worldview, respect it, but not submit to it.
Yeah. I mean, for me, the far bigger problem is not the Treasury itself, but it's the fundamental issue that, we are not living within our means. Our economic model is unsustainable. It involves essentially rinsing the ever dwindling number of contributors to the economy, who are increasingly in a minority, to pay for an ever expanding welfare and pensions bill, but without running the risk of kind of coming on the raw end of the Laffer curve and taxing them too much that you end up losing money because more of them have gone to Dubai or wherever. So the middle earners get even more clobbered. And I think this is what's about to happen in the budget, by the way. And meanwhile, much of this is done on the prognostications of the OBR,
Yes.
which is an organization that is so consistently wrong in its predictions that, half of me wonders if they did it with that octopus that can predict football matches, like we might get better results. I mean, honestly, so I feel like there's really not much we can do until these political shibboleths are challenged. There's no sign that they can be challenged. And so meanwhile, this Treasury discourse is quite convenient to particularly some in government, because it allows there to be a scapegoat for some of the problems, and also to cleave to the idea that if this particular set of ministers had absolute control and they were not in hock to the Treasury as they were, then things would be fantastic. But from what I can make out, everything is going in the direction of all other budgets being trimmed to pay for pensions and welfare that will only increase.
Yes, and I think you're absolutely right that, of course, there can be a big political decision that's made by the Prime Minister or the Chancellor. In this case, it is a desire to, as far as we can tell, end the two-child benefit cap and to further increase the welfare budget. And then what the Treasury will do is accept these big political decisions, implement them, put the engineering in place. But all of these decisions, you're absolutely right, are taking place within a broader set of assumptions about how the economy works, that is shaped by the Treasury brain analysis and Treasury boy operations. So organizations which are marking the Treasury's homework, like the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, or the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the independent think tank that looks at these things, the OBR, the IFS, they are, as I'm afraid I put it in the past, organizations with acronyms that have got things wrong in the past. And the expertise that they have is great if you want to get a first-class honours degree in PPE from Oxford University, but it also means that there's a certain, I hesitate to say arrogance, but there's a certain assumption about how the world works that is coldly academic and precise, and that misses out some of the other aspects, both the animal spirits, but also the brio that you need in a growing economy. And as you say, it assumes the behavior on the part of the economy that fits models but doesn't accurately describe the way in which we as individuals react.
And perhaps not helped by the fact that, as is a real issue for this government in particular, but probably many in the Treasury, you have some very clever on paper people who are a real dab hand with the spreadsheets, but
Yes.
fundamentally they don't know what it is to hire someone to deal with the stress that comes with managing a business, the constant worry about if you're going to meet payroll, and what the ever-changing assortment of rules and tax changes will mean for you and your business. I mean, these sentiments are just quite alien to these, I'm sure, very clever
Mm.
Dans and Maxes and Wills, but they are lacking that crucial insight into human behavior. And perhaps that will also mean that they struggle for all their economic expertise to predict behavior and therefore to look at the incentives in the most effective way.
Completely. And they, as you say, are unlikely to have the rough and tumble buccaneer outlook of entrepreneurs. And it is a striking thing that it's almost as though the Treasury is as garlic or a silver crucifix to entrepreneurship as an activity, because there is something messy, and there is something daring, and there is something about being an entrepreneur which means that your risk appetite, and also your willingness to not so much cut corners but to think imaginatively and laterally, doesn't fit with the sort of left brain, classically neat-edged approach towards economics that prevails within the Treasury. So again, that is why different governments over time have tried to capture something of that entrepreneurial spirit by either having a Michael Heseltine or trying to bring in a business advisor to number 10. But because the Treasury is ultimately in the position of exercising veto power and controlling the budgets of individual government departments and so on, it's there as the sternly nannying rather than the excitingly daring voice that determines economic policy.
If we were to, because the question was, is the Treasury fit for purpose? What changes do you think could be made to it to make it more effective, or perhaps changes to the fundamental structure of the Treasury and the amount of power that it has?
I think the first thing is personalities matter. So you need to have an intellectually self-confident, almost to the point of swaggering figure as Chancellor of the Exchequer. It is undeniably the case that the most successful chancellors, Lawson, Brown, Osborne, but going back over time, Gladstone, were people who had their own degree of intellectual self-confidence, their own degree of political authority. That's the first thing. The second thing also, I think, is that, and again, it comes back to personality, you need to have a prime minister who is able, either because of the strength of their relationship with their chancellor or because of their own intellectual and character strength, to bend the Treasury to their will. There have been proposals, including from my friend Francis Moore, to break up the Treasury, to put the public control, a public expenditure control function into the Cabinet Office, and to make the Treasury an economics ministry, a bit like some of our continental neighbours. I can see the merit in that, but I think ultimately I take the Tory view that personality, character, men not measures, determine the shape of a government. And so one of the tragedies that we have is that Rachel Reeves herself, whatever else one might think about her, has a very civil service-ish, Bank of England-ish view of the world. And Keir Starmer seems to have, well, almost no economic view. And so you have a vacuum in number 10 and someone in the Treasury who isn't disposed to think that this institution is in any way deficient.
Okay, this question is from Luke Forster. Dear Michael, I saw your tweet over the weekend recommending Piers Morgan for Director General of the BBC. Were you serious? And if not, who would you actually pick?
I was serious. And I know that this intervention into the debate has attracted cynicism, criticism, and some people who think that I've gone absolutely crackers. But my suggestion is driven by the fact that the BBC has had essentially a succession of leaders who've tended to come from the broadcast equivalent of the blob. And so all of the names that have been mentioned as the next Director General as favourites, Charlotte Moore, Jay Hunt, are all people who, of course, have storied pasts in broadcasting, but they're just cut from exactly the same cloth. And I think that if the BBC is going to survive, then it needs to have someone who has both a populist touch, as Piers Morgan undoubtedly does, and a degree of journalistic daring, which he's shown, albeit sometimes that he's made some dreadful mistakes, and also someone who has the strength of character to be able to deal with the allegations of woke bias. And the thing about Piers is that he's very alive to that. He's got some views, for example, on questions to do with the Middle East that I disagree with, but I don't think that that matters as much as having someone who is prepared to, again, and there are probably parallels here with the Treasury as well, take risks. Because I think if the BBC squats where it is at the moment, accepts that it might have made a mistake over the Trump footage, but it's not a systemically, dysfunctional organization, then its influence will decline. It will be ripe for a license fee withdrawal when the charter comes up for review, if not shortly, then 5 years after that. So it's got to adapt or die. And my suggestion was a way of saying to anyone else who's interested in this debate, well, can you come up with something better? And if people can come up with other ideas, both for what the BBC should do and who might lead it, great. But most of the criticisms that have been mounted against Piers, and my suggestion of Piers Morgan, have been about mistakes that he'd made in the past when Daily Mirror editor. And by definition, he will have learnt from those. And also, if there was as I say, a degree of tabloid zing to the way in which the news operation at the BBC operated, I don't think that would be a bad thing.
Yeah, I'm trying to think who has fulfilled the role well in the past, and where did they come from? Because you will know more about this than me. I'm interested in how often, because much was made of the fact that Tim Davie was a Conservative when he
Yes.
was appointed, but crucially, he was very much a BBC man through and through. And I think we could see that also with the resignation of Deborah Turness, the CEO, when she was asked about what had gone wrong. She said, I fully support the integrity of our journalism. Mistakes will be made, which to me seemed to kind of minimize the scale of what had gone wrong, which was not a few isolated mistakes, but a very clear pattern that was backed up by very specific reasons for it. So, for example, you have an overmighty sort of LGBT desk that is controlling much of the stories that are selected, and therefore giving a very partial view of all reporting on this extremely important issue, meaning that the BBC is behind the times. And you have, in the case of the Trump footage, exactly the same technique of dishonest cutting being made two different programs a long way apart. It's not just isolated mistakes. And there's that fear that if you have an insider, they will continue to minimize what has gone wrong. Sort of reminds me of like in the you sometimes get this in the early Christian church in England. If things are going really badly, they sometimes just find a kind of random hermit to come and serve at a high level of the church. I think King Alfred does this at one point. Just summons a hermit to come and do it. Maybe we need the modern day equivalent of a hermit, and it's quite interesting to think that might be Piers Morgan. But I guess stranger things have happened.
Yes, no. Piers is notable, I think, for not having led a hermetic lifestyle, and I think in this case it's probably the equivalent of the church trying to find the most dissolute Don Juan that they can, and seeing if he can correct the institution. But central
Boris
point,
Johnson for Archbishop.
precisely, the central point you make, though, it gets to the heart of it, which is that every time that the BBC has made a mistake, and these mistakes have overwhelmingly been reflecting a sort of broadly left liberal position, they've always said, oh, terribly sorry there, and then tried to teach it as though, tried rather to present it as though it were an aberration, when in fact it has been a feature, not a bug, of how the BBC has operated. So you need someone who will make the organization rethink, not quite from first principles, but rethink why it's got itself into these positions, and also recruit into the BBC people who will think differently and originally. I can't imagine that if we had the range of opinions, views, and suggestions for stories that you get at a Spectator editorial meeting on a Monday or a Friday, replayed into the BBC, that people in the BBC would begin to understand what we were talking about most of the time. And that's part of the problem.
Yes.
It's a failure of not just imagination and empathy, but it's a failure to have what journalists should, which is an openness both to mischief and exploration, but also a fidelity to the
A
truth.
curiosity as well.
Precisely. Exactly.
Yeah.
In a word.
Well, I think much has been made of the politics, and I do think that is significant that you have. I don't know if it would be very interesting if they had a kind of anonymous poll of those working the BBC to get a sense of what the true opinions are. But I'm pretty sure that it was known in the 1980s, 1990s that the BBC, the most read newspaper there that was delivered to most desks was The Guardian, and this was kind of understood. I think that's often been the case, but the BBC journalists of the past were clearly better at not allowing their personal views to conflict with the editorial output that was going out. I think that it's possible to do both, and I don't, in a way, that many will think the solution is to find someone that is right wing or right wing coded as part of the solution. But in theory, you could have someone that shared those views, that just had a better understanding of the kind of Reithian principles and the importance of impartiality, especially at a time when there are lots of other broadcasters, other media platforms that are offering much of what the BBC used to do exclusively. So actually, in that world, impartiality is something the BBC can offer the world that's really nobody else is doing. So all the more reason to double down on it. But instead, they seem to be going in the opposite direction.
Completely. There are a variety of journalists on the left, or certainly left-coded, who I've seen exhibit exactly that degree of curiosity, that openness to other ideas, that pluralism. So, in no particular order, Janine Gibson, who edits the Weekend FT, Sonia Soda, who was the chief leader writer at The Observer, Janice Turner, who's a Times columnist.
Yes.
Interestingly, all female journalists or women journalists,
Yes.
all of them are people who, insofar as you can discern from everything that they've written, would probably have voted Labour or for left-wing parties far more often than they would ever have voted Conservative at all, if at all. But all of whom are proper journalists in that their openness to persuasion, for example, the way in which Janice Turner has written about the assisted dying bill. You and I both have very strong views on it. Janice Turner started out as someone who was broadly sympathetic to the aims of the bill, but having looked at the evidence has now come to the conclusion that it's not fit for purpose. But that's just typical of the way that she operates. And having people like that, I think, is absolutely critical. Now, those three and others, perhaps in the same mold, might feel it was horrendous to be bracketed in the same way as someone like Piers, because they might consider that Piers is too much the showman, too much the vulgarian. But I actually think that if you had someone like a Piers Morgan, he would be the person who would set out to say, well, I'll have someone like Janine Gibson as my deputy. I will have someone like Sonia Soda as the head of news and current affairs. I'll have someone like Janice Turner as the presenter on the Today programme, because there's a fearlessness and an open-mindedness about them that we need to bring into the corporation.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think what's happened in America is interesting, where they seem to be going more in that direction. Barry Weiss has just been made editor-in-chief of CBS News, which has really put a lot of noses out of joint. But you understand why that decision was taken. She's probably a figure that I suppose, I think post October the 7th, much of her output has been related to Israel and anti-Semitism. The Free Press, which is, I don't know if she still edits the Free Press, but they're a very new news outlet, putting out some really very thoughtful long form journalism of a kind that was potentially lacking in other areas. But to go for someone like Barry Weiss, I think it's a measure that we have reached in America, at least. There's been a sort of retrenchment, and they're now looking for something potentially annoying people if it means a necessary shake up to the old way of doing things. Perhaps that's what's needed here in with the BBC. I suppose another question that I have, I think the job of the Director General has become a lot more complicated in recent decades, because the job is, I think, uniquely demanding one in British media. Whereas many news organisations will have an editor, they usually have people who basically manage all of the business side of things separately. But my understanding is the Director General combines some aspects of a kind of chief exec role, and as well as being the editor in chief. I almost think that given the problems seem to be overwhelmingly of editorial control, they need to get someone who can really zone in on that specific issue. So maybe they need to rethink the demands that are being placed on the job in general, because it might in fact alienate people who are of the news themselves, who don't necessarily think they have that kind of business acumen, and therefore might not put themselves forward for the job.
I think that's completely fair, because I think that the BBC has adapted and grown to new challenges, demands that have been placed on it. For example, commissioning material from independent producers rather than in-house. Some of the difficulties that it's had, like the Gaza documentary that was authored by a young boy whose father was a Hamas official, that was made by an independent production company. That was a challenge. And similarly, some of the BBC websites output, so not just the broadcast output, but the broader news output there, has come under scrutiny. The BBC push news notifications, BBC Verify, and so on. So you're right. The Empire has had to expand its reach because of the way in which the media landscape has altered. And it may be too much for any one individual to guide the editorial philosophy there, and at the same time be aware of all of the commercial imperatives. Our final question this week comes from Minty Gao. And she asks, what do you make of so-called Mar-a-Lago face, whereby Republicans suddenly undergo drastic plastic surgery when they become regulars on conservative media? Is there a British equivalent?
Oh my goodness. Well, a great question. Even better name, Minty Gao. Amazing. Well, I think that the phenomenon is very strange, very noticeable. I think it's basically turning politics into more and more like TV, which actually is very appropriate when you consider that the president cut his teeth on TV and was best known for a reality TV show before entering politics. It's very noticeable. I was amazed. Weirdly, it's supposed to have an anti-aging effect, but actually sometimes it can make very young women in the Republican Party are getting it done, and they really don't need it, and it weirdly makes them look kind of strangely timeless. But so, for example, Caroline Levitt, the extremely talented press secretary, or I don't know if that's the name of the job, but the kind of head of comms who deals with the press conferences, she's only something like 27, but she's clearly had various things done, and I think is a naturally very beautiful woman. So I kind of wonder why the necessity for it. But I'm told that if you go on, I've never been on Fox News myself, but people I know who have say that you have to get there really early because they really slather on the makeup with the trowel. So you need to be there like 2 or 3 hours in advance to be properly caked up. it creates an air of unreality. I sometimes wonder if it may actually be quite useful for politicians to have had a lot of Botox, because your face becomes less expressive as a result, and maybe that means that you give away a bit less in your facial features. Um, Maybe all poker players should have a lot of work done as well. I don't know. Is there a British equivalent? No, I'm not sure. I think the British are we're always a bit, when America sneezes, we catch a cold, as the saying goes. So perhaps that's the direction in which we are heading. I don't think there's the equivalent. I say the thing I am noticing aesthetically, and without naming anyone in particular, is just a lot of people in Westminster are basically just disappearing because have been on Ozempic
Yes.
or Manjaro. So some MPs have basically halved in size, and I think sometimes, it's like good for you, and for health reasons, perhaps that's a good move. But do genuinely think some people look better when they're carrying a bit of weight. For example, Nigel Lawson looked much better when he was plump, I think. Skinniness did not suit him. And not that I want to take that achievement away from him. And it's also a bit of a running joke in British politics, isn't it? When a minister loses a lot of weight, everyone assumes that they're running for leadership.
Completely. Whereas we know that in Rob Jenrick's case, it's simply the adoption of a healthier lifestyle in order to make sure that he can look after his three young daughters. You are right. There are some politicians who have conspicuously lost weight recently, and so both Alex Shelbrooke of the Conservatives and Carolyn Harris have paid tribute to the benefit that Manjaro / Wegovy / Ozempic has had on them. My old friend Kit Malthouse is also looking lither. I don't know in Kit's case whether or not injections play a role. I'll probably have a chance to ask him later today. More broadly,
I'm sure he'll be only too delighted that you mentioned him today.
I love Kit. And I only wish there was more of him again to love. But I do think that there's not quite a British equivalent of a Mar-a-Lago face. I can't think, maybe listeners will correct me, of any British politician who's had plastic surgery, or certainly plastic surgery on their sort of face or features. I'm not aware of any, though please do let me know if you are aware of anyone's secrets. I'm not even aware of broader tweakments. Perhaps I'm the wrong person to be able to discern what those are. But I do think that there are certain style ticks. So it's oft been remarked that there is a particular type of bob that Labour ministers have, female Labour ministers have. There's a particular sort of work-ready hairstyle that is there. And then the other thing also is, for almost every minister, indistinguishably, whatever party, there is a shade of navy. I think I'm probably wearing it now, which is the uniform suit. I cannot remember the last time, and again, listeners, please do let me know, when any British politician has been caught in public wearing tweed. Again, there is it's not the case that there's plastic surgery, but it is the case that there is a plastic Ken and Barbie doll identikit uniform that more and more politicians do conform to. But I think
Yes.
it's done just as a way, to be fair to them, of trying to avoid commentary on their looks rather than invite it.
Yeah, it's a school uniform, and for that very
Exactly.
same reason.
You may remember, Maddie, that our colleague Charles Moore once said of the actress Olivia Colman that she had a left-wing face. Do you think, dress aside, that there is such a thing as a right-wing face or a left-wing face when you're looking down from the gallery and you're gazing on the visages of our members of parliament?
I think there's a important distinction to make between a conservative face and a right-wing face.
Yes.
For example, I think Nigel Farage has a more of a right-wing face than a conservative face. There's definitely, it's actually very hard to detach someone's actual facial features from their aesthetics. For example, when I see the power bob walking around Westminster that you referred to earlier, there's a 98% chance that they're in the Labour Party, because it's a very popular hairstyle at the moment. I've noticed that ambitious Labour MPs who wish to get ahead often adopt something of that similar style. Although interestingly, Rachel Reeves used to have it in a big way, and now she's gone for something longer and softer,
Yes, she's
more
grown it out.
tousled. Lucy Powell had it, and then when she became deputy, but actually returned to the backbenches, she's also gone for something a bit less severe. So it's really, there used to be, almost everyone in the cabinet, all women in the cabinet had that hairstyle, and now I think it's only Shabana Mahmood and Bridget Phillipson, which is interesting because they're two of the ones that they've maintained their power base or increased it. So maybe to be powerful in the Labour Party means you have to have that haircut. There's a kind of Samson element to it. What do you think about the who do you think is the kind of the platonic ideal of a Conservative face?
I saw many of them earlier this week.
Clarissa Dixon Wright.
Well, the Clarissa Dixon Wright certainly, Kirsty Allsop possibly, but this week there was a very sad occasion. All of the hereditary members of the House of Lords were gathered together for a sort of farewell photograph on the benches of the House of Lords. And a chap called Andy Parsons, who used to be David Cameron and Boris Johnson's in-house photographer at Number 10, was there. And I was there observing as we saw all of the 70-odd hereditary peers, all men, of course. And a small number, of course, were Labour, Lib Dem, fair proportion were crossbenchers, majority Conservatives. But they all had Conservative faces. And so there was a slight ruddiness to the cheek. There was a slight swept back wing over the ear that suggested that the hair had been cut a fortnight ago at Trumpers and was due for another trim. There was a very light, but only very light sprinkling of dandruff on one or two shoulders. But what you saw there were, as I say, more than 70 people who were actually public servants whose service was coming to an end. And it was melancholy. Even though we don't often have photographs of politicians in The Spectator, we tend to have illustrations, caricatures, and so on. It's one photograph that I hope that we will be able to run, both because it's a piece of history, but also because there was, looking into those eyes, you could see, a particular order passing away. And so while it was a melancholy occasion, they were all smiling, and they were smiling with a certain degree of, and again, please forgive this this dreadful nostalgic phrase, a degree of pluck, as they contemplated their ejection from the place that many of them had served for years.
Well, I never say never. Perhaps one day they can be restored to their proper place.
I think that when you are Prime Minister, Maddie, we will make sure that happens. In the meantime, if you are concerned about Mar-a-Lago face or any other aspect of how politicians and figures reconstruct their identity, then tune in next week when Maddie and I will be deconstructing the politics of Westminster and the broader scene in Quite Right.
Thank you so much for listening. And if you'd like to submit your questions for Quite Right next week, you can do so at spectator.co.uk/Quite Right.